Thanks for coming back. I was commenting to somebody earlier that doing Q&A is sort of like being a wide receiver and having no idea what the play is. The ball is going to be thrown and you just need to run, and sometimes you're like, that's not even a football. So it's great to be here and be thinking through some of these questions that we have. I was coming through the Canadian border last year, and the customs agent said, "What do you do for a living?" And I said, there wasn't anybody behind me in line, and I wasn't in a hurry, so I said, well, I try to answer fourth-degree why questions. And he said, what in the world is a fourth-degree why question? And I said, well, if you make any statement and I ask you why 4 times about that, that fourth question will be a really interesting one. And he said, well, what do you mean? I said, so let's say, and he's like, I'm on an airplane. Why? Because it's part of my job and I want to make money. Why? Because I want to have a really good life. Why? So, okay, on the fourth why question, that's where it starts to get interesting. And we live in a world that asks a lot of how and what questions. How am I going to pay my rent? What am I going to eat for dinner? That sort of thing. But rarely do we stop and slow down enough to ask, why am I doing this in the first place? And part of the reason that RZIM focuses on university students is it is a unique opportunity in life for people to be in a situation, in a space where they have time to ask big questions, why questions. And so that's some of the angle and the experience that I have is answering the questions of university students, which are probably pretty different than that of this room. So I'll do my best. There are roving microphones, just like the last day or two. If you raise your hand, somebody will bring a mic to you, and we'll take it from there. The first question is always the hardest, so if you want to start with the second question, that'll... And then over here, yeah.
In your experience and what you're seeing, is there the question is, for those in the faith community who are coming to untraditional conclusions regarding marriage and so on and so forth, what is that group's understanding of the Jesus being the only way? In other words, how did they see that?
Yeah. So there would, I think initially the response would be that there would be a separation in seeing Jesus as a way of salvation and Jesus as a way of life. So that would be a distinction that would be made there. The broader question that needs to be asked when somebody says Jesus is the only way, and usually the way that that's presented as an objection is to say, isn't it arrogant to say that Jesus is the only way, is a type of exclusivity and exceptionalism that is very much frowned upon. And as a Christian, when somebody says, isn't it arrogant to say that Christianity is the only way, we need to respond with a question, the only way to what? Because Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. And so for Jesus, the way is an access into relationship with our Heavenly Father, which is something that no other religion is actually offering. In fact, that's blasphemous in other religions to say that you can have a relationship with God in that same way. And so in some senses, we take our kind of Christian cultural presuppositions and impose those. You could even call it metaphysical colonialism if you want to say, that you're imposing your kind of Christian worldview on every other religion, and you end up turning it around on them as the bad guys. But the fact of the matter is that Jesus isn't just another kid with a different colored kickball on the playground. He's talking about a whole different system of religion and interaction with God. And so to get back to the original part of your question, when we say, if you have a non-traditional view of something, how do you see Jesus as the way? Well, if you see the conclusion of Jesus being the way is relationship with the Father, then God does become the foundation for what we might call traditional belief. And I think there's room to think through this in your own mind of how much we want to use words like traditional marriage. Maybe we should use words like convictional marriage. Because if we say, I believe in traditional marriage, you're saying the reason that I believe in this form of marriage is just because of tradition. That's not the reason that I believe in that form of marriage. I think that's something revealed by God, and it's a created order. And so sometimes I think the language that we use gets mixed up there. The second thing is that on questions about virtue in general, specifically on definitions of love, we need to ask the question of where do these things come from in the first place? Where does love come from? And so if I am the one that defines love, and I'm the one who sets the standards, then any way in which I express that that's good to me is an acceptable version of love. But as Christians, we believe that God is love by definition, that he has that as a pre-existing condition on his health form. He is love. And if that is true, then true love is participating in a pre-existent love, not developing our own definition of love. And so if God made me to participate in his love, then I find the most pleasure in doing it within the parameters in which I was created to do it. And so it's a call to a higher view. I think oftentimes in our conversations about sexuality, it seems like a headbutting competition, but we're calling to a higher vision of what could be, of categories of intimacy and satisfaction and commitment that transcend rather than impede our sexuality. And so it's, again, it's a call to lift our eyes higher to what could be. And I find that to be a helpful way of critiquing and kind of goading people into thinking, what if there's more? Specifically, if Jesus is our definition of what it means to be fully human and he was single and celibate, we're going to have to get away from this cultural idea that our sexual expression is the pinnacle of what it means to be a human. And the church is going to have to provide the alternative model and illustration for what that possible other world looks like. So those are just some thoughts on that. Thank you.
I was just curious to know what your home church is now and how you met your wife.
Oh, yeah, two good questions. So officially, I'm still a member of New Hope Church of the Brethren in Pocahontas County, West Virginia. And while I've been in school, my wife and I attend kind of a local non-denominational church in the morning as our normal church. And then we go to an Anabaptist hybrid house church in the evening. So we kind of dance back and forth between those two. And yeah, I feel like we find some places to worship in that. And my wife and I met in college. We actually both ran cross country. So yeah. So did one other person. Great.
I was a bit intrigued by your comment yesterday about the church and the Christian people in the New England area. Why are the Christian people so different in the New England area than they are in, I guess, some other parts of the country? You mentioned the fact that to be a Christian in New England, you're going to stand out. What's the cultural difference in that area?
Yeah, I think if you could answer that, you should write a book about it, and I'll read it. Here's an interesting, let me pose a bigger problem and then try to think about that a little bit. Are there any genuinely secular societies in the world that have not been preceded by a Christian culture? So if you think about a Switzerland or a Europe and the plethora of acceptance of ideas in that liberal academic environment, that comes out of a Christian society. There's no other worldview that allows for dissenting ideas and those people to still live and function and be part of society. And so you have your Harvards and your Yales and those academic institutions that are founded deeply on, I walk through Harvard and look at the scripture inscribed in the stones. You go through one of the gates and, it says, what is man that you're mindful of him? Psalm 8 on one of the buildings, lift up your head, O you gates, as you go through the arches. Of course, most people are looking at the phones in their hands when they go through. But there's that type of history there that allows for different ideas and the engagement of different ideas. And so I think you do get I think your more secular societies grow out of pre-Christian context, because Christianity does allow for asking questions and disagreeing and going from there. And so maybe New England is only different in the sense that it's had a couple hundred years head start on the rest of the country. And that would be the best answer that I can give on that. I don't think it has to do with it being cold and people being cranky, but I think it has to do with the cultural atmosphere of putting a lot of eggs in the basket of our academic pursuits to the exclusion of other questions about the fullness of what it means to be human.
What do you think will be the big issues coming up? Not the ones we're discussing this year, but what will we be talking about next year when it comes to apologetics?
Yeah, great question. So there's been a lot of apologetic response to New Atheism, Richard Dawkins, all that. The books, and I think that's all pretty much on its way out. Islam certainly poses an interesting challenge, threat. But I think in some ways there's the kind of thing where you're boxing your little brother and you're like, watch my left, and then you kick him in the knee sort of thing, where we can get distracted by one thing and miss out on what's happening with something else. And I think that, and we talked about a little bit about this, Ruben, that the rise of neo-paganism will be the next thing that the church will really need to be able to engage with, other forms of spirituality that don't fit in a nicely defined religious system. And I think we like to critique and structure our arguments against other things that we can define, but a lot of the neo-pagan movement isn't really something you can, here are 5 things they believe, and you can critique it this way. So I think we'll have to be more prepared to speak about spirituality in general as people move into this phase of being religious, or being spiritual but not religious. So on the surface level in New England, for example, at Dartmouth, they recently did a survey, and 88% of the students there said they're on a spiritual journey of some sort. Well, if you just looked around campus, you wouldn't say this is a booming religious place. So there's stillness on top of the water, but underneath there's some turbulent things going on. So there is still this huge spiritual search and desire to connect to something bigger than ourselves that's out there, and the church will have to be prepared to wrestle with that. Somebody asked me recently, right before the session, what do you sense a desire for God in the culture? And I think there's no hunger and thirst for righteousness in the majority of places that we go, but there is a desire and an interest for stability and genuine foundations of hope, which are both things that Christianity has an abundance of. And so I think if we started thinking about coming out of a post-modern culture where we've said, morality is relative, and then you look at ISIS chopping people's heads off, you're thinking, I want to condemn that and say that it's wrong, but I don't have a moral framework or grounding to say that that's wrong. So the church has to be there to help, as people, I think, are coming back around to asking some of those questions about morality specifically, will be a big one moving forward. But somehow wrapped up in the sense of being spiritual but not religious, which basically means I want some type of connection with something bigger than myself, but I don't want it to impose any parameters on what it is that I do, which is a interesting thing in and of itself. It's basically, I'm interested in sex but not marriage, in a religious format. So that's my, I haven't been reading anything. That's just me making that up as what I think is the next thing we need to be ready for, and something that I feel like I'm weak in, really. We haven't engaged well spiritually and specifically as we have more immigrants from other parts of the world who live in an animistic worldview or something like that. There's a lot of work to be done there as Christians.
I'm from Michigan, rather firmly situated in the Midwest, and when you said that about Boston, it made me think about my area where it's almost the opposite, where everybody's a Christian, but it's kind of the wave the rebel flag, wear the pistol on your hip type of thing, and not really go to church much. At least I have a lot of trouble getting my folks just to come to church. And I really like the idea also. I guess I wanted you to speak a little bit to that, as to, have you been in those situations where that was the case, and how's the best way to break through the people who, if you ask them, oh yeah, they're a Christian, and this church that I'm pastoring, that's my church and so on, but I never see them. And then the other thing that I wanted to say was that I really appreciated your distinction between Christocentric and Christological, and wondered if you could expand on that just a bit more. And the third question, if you have a really good resource, you writing these down?
I need to, yeah.
A really good resource on the relationship between the Old and the New Testament from a conservative Anabaptist perspective, I'd appreciate hearing about that.
Yeah, I might have to poll the audience on that one. But so let's start off with the nominal Christian world. The nominal Christian world and the not at all Christian world share some similar ideas, in the sense that they think they know what Christianity actually is. And we often think of our job as ministers or teachers or apologists as introducing faith. I think there's a real role also for us to be people that introduce doubt, specifically introducing doubt in the mind of somebody else of whether or not they actually know what Christianity is. And so if you're in a workplace and you have no Christian friends at all, and their only view of Christianity is what they get off the news, but they become friends with you, then when they hear this, they'll say, oh, well, I know this guy, and that's not exactly how he sees the world. And so your existence introduces doubt into their presuppositions about Christianity. I think the same thing could be said to be true about our interactions with nominal Christianity in the same way of, we all assume, some people call that a Christian inoculation. It's like you've received the antidote or the vaccine against it. You can't become a Christian because you've known just enough to make you think you know it. And so I think asking a lot of questions is a good way forward in that. And you have Jesus saying, "Why do you say to me, Lord, Lord, but don't do what I say?" So the scriptural weight is definitely behind it. But I think we'll have to do a little more challenging in some categories just to say, hey, when you say you're a Christian, what do you mean by that? And see where it goes from there, probably. The second question about the difference between Christological and Christocentric is I think that probably in this room, the vast majority of us have grown up with a Christocentric model. And so it doesn't even compute really to think that there's a category outside of that. But the Christological one would just be simply that the sole purpose of Jesus is for his sacrificial qualities, not his lordship necessarily. And so it's what he did on our behalf that justifies us in the eyes of God. Jesus is the guy who gives us access, which we believe, that's true, but we think there's a whole lot more to what Jesus had to say and do while he was here too. And so it's that distinction that is true often in nominal Christianity as well, that is something to be challenged and pushed past, that Jesus isn't merely our Savior, but he's also our Lord. And so being consistent, and the New Testament's a language. What is the good news in the gospel? Jesus comes and announces the good news. Well, there were other, when Augustus was born in one of the Caesars born early, before Christ, there are inscriptions, the gospel of the birth of this king. This is supposed to be good news. And when Jesus shows up and says, good news, the kingdom of God is here, that's an interesting statement because the annunciation of a kingdom is not by default good news. That's just news. If I said, hey, good news, Assad is king, you're like, no, probably not. So whether or not the proclamation and the annunciation of a kingdom is good news or not is directly dependent on the character and the nature of the king who's being announced. And so when Jesus shows up and says, good news, the kingdom of God is at hand, oh, and by the way, I'm the king, that's a king I can get excited about. That is good news. And so we, I think, want to think through that example too, that who's in charge of this thing? Who's running this show? And it's Christ, and there's a fullness that comes from acknowledging that he's the one in charge that I think is the direction we want to push those in the nominal margins and ourselves always be striving to being obedient to. And so I would go that direction. On the third question about resources between the Old and New Testament and conservative Anabaptist scholarship on that, I would say conservative Anabaptist scholarship is an interesting category in of itself in most areas. And so my wheels are spinning, but I don't have a whole lot of resources for you on that. But there probably is somebody in this room who does have a good resource on that. I could recommend to you the chapter in the book that I referenced yesterday, The Biblical Interpretation in the Anabaptist Tradition by Stuart Murray would be one of those. Also, I've read, is it J.C. Wanger wrote an old introduction to Christian theology that might have some interesting thoughts on that as well in that category. So those, I would start with Murray, though. I think he gives a good historical perspective of the way that that's been handled and some of the pros of that and some of the faults that we've slipped into in the past. All the way in the back.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about ways that we can communicate truth in our churches to people who may have never heard what we're talking about before. And so I think, in particular, I'm thinking in our church, when we talk about peace and how we interact in the world, and we have quite a few people we have a Navy SEAL in our congregation who's probably never heard of this before, people in the police force, whoever. And so how do we talk about truth in a way that it can be received where, we're expecting to take this huge step and taking them in smaller steps to understand and receive that truth. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I grew up in a church that had non-resistant leadership and members of every branch in the military attending the congregation, and there's some interesting dynamics that happen there. I think probably where I would start at with that, and this is good for me to remember on a daily basis, is that when it comes to non-resistance, first of all, I think we want to be very clear about why we hold that position. And if we're doing it just out of the tradition of our conference or congregation, that's interesting. I think that our objection should be conscientious, not congregational, that it should be at an individual level, because there's no way you can legislate that for when somebody breaks into somebody else's house, is the first thing. But the broader, I think where I would start with that is saying that Jesus's encouragement and commands, very rarely do I have the opportunity to shoot somebody or the need to shoot somebody or to push the button to nuke somebody. That's probably will never happen to me in my life, statistically speaking. And I hope it doesn't. Daily, I have the opportunity to turn the other cheek verbally. And so we often take non-resistance to this extreme about physical violence and warfare and forget what it means in our daily life and in our relationships and interactions with other people. And there's probably a lot of room for us to be teaching in that category first, that it's about the orientation of our hearts toward the other, and it starts there and grows out from there, not on the outside and comes in. I know some people who are pro-peace that are frankly fairly hateful people. Well, if you've been divorced 3 times, can you really go around the world teaching about peace and reconciliation? I know people have gone to Israel to throw rocks at the tanks to show they support peace. Work that one out for me. And so we want to be consistent starting from the individual heart and going out from there. And so I think when your question is about how do we start to introduce that truth, that it starts with the individual and their individual relationships, not probably in the military complex view, and let it grow from the core out. And that would just be my initial thought on that.
There are many times when I am just so sure of what I believe, and hearing you again, you're sure of what you believe. It doesn't seem like it's illogical. In your mind, why is it still so few that find this way? Because to me, it's easier today intellectually to be a Christian than it was 100 years ago.
Yeah.
There's much better apologetics out there. There's much more articulate things. But some days it feels we're not making much progress, even though we've made huge progress intellectually. Why is that?
A quote by Chesterton comes to mind where he says, Christianity has not been tried and found wanting. It's been tried, found difficult, or it's been found difficult and left untried. And I think genuine Christianity does come at a cost. Luke 14, you have that whole side of things, that there is a high task and a high standard there. And there is a sense in which the gospel really grates against an American individualism and a bootstraps, and I can do this on my own. And that is offensive. That might be one of the most offensive things that you can say in America, is that you need other people and you can't do it on your own. So I think for cultural reasons and for intellectual and for stubbornness and hard-hearted reasons, there's that element of it. The other thing is that the question is a little bit more like, why isn't God more obvious? And a year or two ago, I was riding with a friend of mine, and she was driving the car, and her sister was up front, and I was sitting in the back minding my own business. We were going to a meeting, and I was staring out the window, and we came to a stop, and I looked out. Traffic was stopped both ways, and there was a car going the other direction that had stopped beside us. That was the most smashed car that I'd ever seen that was still drivable. And I was sitting there thinking to myself, how is the radiator even, and the hood was so buckled that I couldn't figure out how the driver could see past it. And I thought, wow, that is a real wreck. And as I was thinking this in my mind, one of the ladies up front said, that woman has beautiful hair. And her sister said, I was just about to say the same thing. So I'm looking at the smashed car, but I hear about this doubly noted beautiful hair. So I turn and look to see where they're looking, and they're looking at the driver of the car. And I said, how in the world could you look at this, and the detail that's important to you that you take away is the hair of the person driving this wreck down the road? And we had a good laugh about it. But part of it is that I think we look for and we see things that we've been taught to look for, and we look for and see things that are important to us. Now, you might say, obviously your hair is very important to you, so you missed the boat there. But the mechanical functionality of the car was much more interesting to me, and so that's a context that I had grown up in. That was something that I would focus on and look at and be interested in. And the second thing is the things that we're taught to look for, that's the one part, but then the things that are important to us are another thing. And oftentimes when people are pursuing religion, they're not really looking for the categories in which Christianity is offering hope. So if you think historically about what type of gods have there been fertility gods and help and warfare gods and love gods, and those just aren't categories that Christianity is offering anything in. Jesus is in a whole different spectrum, and so we have, I think, the history of the world religiously is looking at how do I do this and earn my salvation, and these are the things that are important for me to attain in my religion, and Jesus is just kind of off here on the side, not in that category. So what I think it's analogous to, and the sad thing for me is that if you had an honest skeptic who walks up to a pine tree and doesn't see any apples and then denies the existence of fruit. Well, there aren't supposed to be apples on a pine tree, but we often have that sort of setup of religion that we have this expectation of what we're going to find in Christianity, but that isn't what Christianity itself actually really promises for us to have, and so they walk away saying, well, it didn't do anything for me. Well, it's not supposed to. So I think it's a combination of some of those things, but it's something for us to be aware of, that the gospel that Jesus preaches and proclaims to us is different often from what other people think they're seeking. But it goes back to the question of what are people really after, and these ideas of stability and hope that are derivatives of the gospel are something that we really have as Christians, and we need to do a better job of saying, look, we have this and this is where it's coming from, and connecting the dots back to this is the fruit that we have and these are the type of roots that it comes from, is the legwork that has to be done in those conversations, I think. So that's a tricky one.
In dealing with moral relativism, there's no more absolutes. Seems to me that one thing just in the practical world that would speak against that would be the principles of math. Those apply no matter where we go.
Yeah.
From jungle to inner city to affluent neighborhoods. Wouldn't that be a legitimate argument against those who say there are no moral absolutes?
So yeah, very interesting. I gave a talk at MIT in January called Of Math and Morals. And the difference between math and morality is that math is the description of what is, morality is a description and a function of what ought to be. And so there is a difference there between those two, that the absolute and the finitude of mathematics doesn't map perfectly onto morality. And so the question is, how do we get from that what is to what ought to be? And so for the person who has kind of truncated reality down into purely mathematical terms, morality isn't even a category that a lot of them think in, which is weird for us to kind of try to wrap our minds around. Sometimes you kind of want to poke them in the eye and go, what'd you think of that? So yeah, I think it's a great spot to start the conversation, but there isn't necessarily a one-to-one correspondence to make that. But it is, you could use that to say, look, math is a description of what is, and are we conscripted in reality simply to what is, or do we have a vision of what could be and what ought to be? And for Christians, we do actually have a foundation of saying what ought to be. It's taught to us by Jesus. And the nice thing about having a foundation for morality is you can actually say that something is wrong, and compassion necessitates moral judgment. To have compassion on somebody, you have to say the situation in which they're in is wrong, and it's wrong enough, and I know it ought to be enough, that I'm actually making a moral judgment that this is wrong, but I'm going to do something about it and have compassion on them and help them out. And so as we unhinge ourselves from morality, our foundation for compassion goes out the window, but also, and this is where there's more leg room to be done, our definition of justice is all over the place. And so this is great fun in Boston to go up to a table of social justice of some sort and be like, hey, I think this is really important too. How are you defining justice? Nobody has a clue. And so I've written this on the board before at different universities, and I stole this from Steve Garber, and it's a book called Visions of Vocation. But if you write out the line, justice is an ideal. All ideals are unrealistic and utopian. Therefore, justice is unrealistic and utopian. And just leave that on the board and ask the group, say, hey, deconstruct this for me a little bit. What's wrong with this syllogism? Or is justice really an ideal and unrealistic? And if you don't have a framework for justice, you can't take that apart, and it really undermines all the, whatever we want to do in social justice. So I think maybe using justice as the question, as the link between moving from what is to what ought to be, and using that language is a helpful direction to go, and kind of stimulating some conversation around that idea. But it's a big category. Rick.
Is part of the problem that morality has become what is and not what it should be? In other words, whatever, we take a poll, and if 100% of people agree with it, well, then that's moral. And we define morality as what actually is and not what it should be.
Yeah, so the question is, have we defined morality as what is rather than actually what should be? And so certainly in local context, you can have the majority or maybe the entire group say this is what's moral. The problem is historically, we know a lot of groups who have all decided that something is right, maybe like eliminating all the Jews. There's a pretty high consistency, and who thought that was a good idea? So historically speaking, you have kind of a number of different ethical theories from Aristotle to Kant to slipping my mind here, happiness calculus, Jeremy Bentham, those guys. But all throughout history, there's always been this idea of a divine command as being the actual foundation of what it is that we should do. So we've tried to come up with a lot of moral systems that are disconnected from an idea of a God, and we just don't have a good track record. The history isn't there to back up us doing a good job of having done that. Now, you do not, and this is important for us to know, you do not have to be a Christian in order to be a good person. You can be a very moral person, and I know a lot of atheists that would shame people who call themselves Christians in their behavior. But the reason for that is that we are very often inconsistent in the worldview in which we have, and we borrow ideas from other groups. That's what Francis Schaeffer called stealing cookies from the Christian cookie jar. I'm not a Christian, but I want to borrow their morality. There's an atheist philosopher named John Gray who wrote a book called Straw Dogs, in which he takes atheists to task and says, we're not living consistently with our faith. We're basically borrowing Christian morality and using that as Christians. So you'll get a lot of interesting new moral theories that have the basis for morality being in the intrinsic value of a human, but there's no grounding for where that intrinsic value of a human comes from. And so that's really where the rub is. So you can get some very creative theories that are functional and practical, but they aren't grounded or rooted in anything. And so you really do have to come back to some of that we talked about yesterday in Euthyphro's dilemma, and our grounding for morality being in the character and nature of who God is, and using that as the platform to move forward. It's actually a very coherent argument. It's kind of like the cosmological argument about existence, and there needs to be a first cause for the physical existence, and we have the same sort of setup going on for the ability to define any type of consistent morality globally. So, yeah.
I'm curious if you've been out of school long enough that you can look at today's undergraduates and say, boy, these people aren't quite like I remember being when I was their age.
Yeah, because I had it all together then. So, no. Actually, there is a fascinating inability to ask good questions. And specifically, as we move into a legitimately secular society, if you're truly liberal enough, somebody can make a truth claim and you don't even think it's worth you taking the time to, you're like, oh, that's true for you. Great, I'm going to go get some coffee. There isn't a pushback or a response there. So I think asking good questions is probably one of the things that really needs to be inspired in an undergraduate, to really challenge things. And the benefit of challenging something as far as it relates to our faith is that the things that we believe the strongest are actually things that we've doubted the hardest. If we've consistently pushed against something and it's always been there, the history of that pushing against us shows us the rigidity of the thing that is that we believe in. And so there should be a freedom, I think, to challenge and push back and go that direction. The second thing is, and we talked about this a little bit, is that at least in my education, and I think this is indicative of a liberal arts education, is we deconstruct everything, and that is the pursuit of education, is to take everything apart, and we're not provided with any framework for putting all those pieces back together in a coherent piece. So I think a good education does let you know what the questions are in a certain field. A great education would let you know what the questions are in a certain field, but would also give you some parameters and guidelines for reconstructing that back into something useful. And a phenomenal education, I think, would let you know what the questions are, give you parameters for reconstructing that, but be taught to you by somebody whose life is worth following and doing the same thing. So is the professor actually bought into this idea, and is that the type of life that you would be interested in living also? Is there a model for this, or is it merely a theoretical thing? And so I would say that the phenomenal education has all three of those components within it. And then the third thing is the ability to relate and connect different fields of ideas to each other. And so much of what we do now in education is we get so academically specific in something that we aren't really sure of how that matters or means anything in other fields. And so if you have spend 4 years and get a biology degree, well, you still need a basis for ethics. One of the MIT students says, oh yeah, I'm interested in weapons development, not really that interested in ethics. Well, that's comforting to know that the people developing our nuclear weapons aren't really interested in ethics. And so it's that sort of thing. Can we, across the curriculum, see how parts and pieces of things play together? And that should be something that we should be able to do as Christians, I think, is connect the dots. And then kind of moving off of your question, that is something worth thinking about, running through what are the types of questions that people normally ask me. So it could be, what's your name? What do you do? Why do you have a beard? Where are you from? But think about what are the types of questions that people normally ask me, and then how can I respond to those in such a way that it sets me up to talk about Jesus? And so for students, for example, I encourage them to think through this. Why am I studying what I'm studying? So say you're studying to be a nurse and somebody says, what do you study? You could say, well, I'm studying to be a nurse. Or you could say, I'm studying to be a nurse because I think human life is really valuable and that's important for me, and so I find a lot of satisfaction in what I'm studying. Now, you haven't shared the gospel with them, but you've made a pretty interesting value statement in addition to a simple question that somebody has asked. And so thinking about, how do I see what I do as my occupation or my vocation or my hobby as something that says something broader about who God is in my relationship and how that connects to my faith, and is all of this woven together in my life? Are we people that can connect the dots across the board like that? And so I would say that that's something that'd be good for Christians to work on, but it's also something good for undergraduate students to recognize that, just because you have a degree in chemistry doesn't mean that art history is completely irrelevant. There's that. Yeah. The question was, why do I have a beard? In some ways, I think that... Yeah, no, I'm going to answer the question. His eyes are blue. I think in many ways it's difficult to know where we're going if we don't remember where we're from. And so some of that for me is a nod to the old school and remembering some of my roots. The other part of it is that several years ago my wife decided she was going to start wearing a head covering. And I thought it was a little bit unfair that she had a marker of distinction in the community and that I kind of could blend in and out of things more easily. And so I started thinking about it a little more symbolically in that sense. And there are lots of fun jokes that I use in Boston. But that's another one. So people say, hey, are you Amish? Why do you have a beard? And I say, well, what do you think is interesting about the Amish? No, I'm not Amish. But, what's attractive to you about that? Well, what do you think about Christianity? And we're talking about Jesus on the subway because of my beard. So that's an example of that. But I have a whole pocket full of, why do you have a beard? Well, I've had it ever since the TSA took my shaving axe and, all that kind of thing. But helps me think during Q&A. Keeps my chin warm and 9 below 0 in Boston. I'm a Red Sox fan. But yeah, the real answer is more for that it does help me think a little bit about who I am and opens up some good conversations.
You spoke a little bit to the undergraduate and how they can connect the dots a little bit. As pastors, how would you say that we could up our ability to connect the dots a little bit better? Better preaching or more discussions specifically as it relates to this area, or what would you say that answer should be?
Yeah, that's a great question. I can only speak from where I don't do it well and can grow, and then maybe that parallels something that you think about in your teaching also. Oftentimes, I think if we spend time studying a text, we think about it so theoretically that it seems in our minds obvious what the application is from that idea. And that's not always the case. And so I think the clarity of application, what is the actual takeaway, what is the to-do point after, if you accept this idea is true, where do you move from there? And I often assume that, hey, I have this idea, and for me it comes sort of naturally to take a complicated idea and think what the application point is for it. But not everybody's minds work the same way. So I think being clear of saying, this is the truth, here's what it is, and this is why it matters, is for all teaching a valuable thing, not just preaching, but teaching in general to say, and this is where, when the rubber hits the road, this is why it matters.
I was just wondering what you think of the effectiveness and whether it should be done or not of Christian people using their all right. Yeah. What do you think of the idea of Christian people using their civic privileges, citizen privileges, and responsibilities to try and change the moral tone of the country that we're in?
Yeah, that's a great loaded question. It sort of sounded like you're being censored as words were being deleted out of you. So I didn't really hear the question, so we'll move on to the next one. Yeah, wow. Two things, I want to answer this very broadly, and then you can come up with the application point. When Jesus talked about power, he always talked about the capacity to serve rather than the capacity to dominate. And as Christians, we want to remember that. In however we're thinking politically or civically, that's important. And the second thing is we want to challenge ourselves to think about whether or not you can impose Christian morality on non-Christians. And in certain parts of the world at certain times that has worked, that we're going to legislate something and that's going to become the law of the land, and then people are going to behave Christianly because that's the law they have to do. And I would challenge that idea that that's the idea that Jesus had for community change and development. So I think you're going to have people that come out of a lot of different places on the extent to which they're going to civically engage on that. But we do have those parameters, at least, that whatever power it is that we do have is to serve. That's important. But also we shouldn't expect Christian behavior from non-Christians. Let me go down this rabbit trail. If you read something like Yoder's Politics of Jesus, for example, I think Yoder's exegesis is right. I think his application is wrong. I think that Jesus envisioned the church as being a group that paralleled society and was distinct from it and called people into it, not something that went into the heart of society and then changed it from the inside out. And there's a difference there in how we see the theology of our engagement with our society based on our theology of the kingdom. So there's a theological thing we need to sort out there of what is the role of the church in changing society. A book that I'm interested in this question, and I just first time I ever pre-ordered a book. I felt kind of nerdy doing it, but Alan Kreider just wrote a book called The Patient Ferment of the Early Church, and I'm interested in looking in that because he says that one of actually I think the claim is that the most prevalent theme in the early church writers was patience. And so how did the early church go from a couple hundred ostracized people to 400 years later, it's the religion of the state. If you want cultural change and a paradigm for that, that's pretty wild. And it wasn't through their political action that result was achieved, but they needed to be patient. It took 400 years for them to gain any social status. So I can't give you a definitive one. I think that'll depend on the individual conscience and the individual congregation, but I think we do have clear biblical parameters for what is it that we're shooting for, and that will guide us and how we view our civic responsibility. There are so many ways in which the church can be a benefit to their community. And it's factually true that a church is 8 times more, so think if the government wants to do a project in your community, it would take them $8 to do this. The church can do it for $1. The local church is phenomenally more efficient at social change. And for those who are joking with Dano Heatwell, Dano and I have had serious conversations about things that we often pin as failures of the government that might actually be failures of the church. Do we expect the government to do for us things that the church naturally ought to do for the down and out and the poor and the needy in our community? And so there is definitely a role for social engagement, but how that works in civic rights is we'll probably have 100 different opinions in the room. So thank you for that question.
You're Richard Showalter. You're addressing a group of pastors, leaders of congregations. You've talked a lot about individual responsibilities, the intellectual frameworks which are appropriate to who we are as members of the body of Christ and so on. Would you talk for a little bit about how you understand the shape of a vital, healthy Christian congregation and the role of leaders, elders, pastors, whoever, in helping to create that kind of congregation?
There's another book or a series. Let me start by saying what I think is really, if I think about looking at university students, what's really healthy, like who is a healthy Christian university student? There's somebody who's thriving but not just surviving. There's somebody who is involved in some type of discipleship, Christian fellowship with their peers. That's an important part of that, but they are also directly connected to a local church. You have to have both of those. If you look at student ministries and you have a student who is only in a campus ministry, the attrition rate from Christianity for that student is really high if they're not connected to a local church. And what the local church allows to happen, it allows the student to see, this is what my faith looks like at multiple phases and categories of life. I'm 19 years old now, but when I'm 29, what does my faith look like? And when I'm 39 and 49 and 89, what does my faith look like throughout all of those phases of life? The second thing is what does my faith look like when it's applied in a whole lot of different occupations and vocations and context rather than just my own? And so the church really offers a plausibility structure for the application of Christianity to a very diverse world. And so Christianity doesn't work just for me and what I'm doing right now. It actually works for 150 other people in this room in a wide, so it stabilizes the curious young person about what does my faith and is it actually applicable to a lot of other areas. So that being said, if I'm thinking about it coming from the young person's perspective, I think that anything that we can do in a church to foster multi-generational theological interaction is a blessing 100 times over. Get the folks in your church that are 80 talking to people in your churches that are in their 20s. It's really helpful, I think, and encouraging for the older generation to see young people coming along who are excited about their faith, and the young person certainly needs the older person's perspective in their life because they've walked down roads and can steer you around potholes that you don't even know existed and that they've already come through. So I would say the multi-generational relationships are crucial for congregational health in one way. The other part is, I think that something I valued from was being allowed to come alongside and wrestle alongside leadership with questions and issues that the church was working through. And so I benefited from people who I respected and really knew that they knew a lot coming to me as a young man and saying, hey, I'm about to preach a sermon on this. I'm not exactly sure what I think about it yet. What do you think this means? And then, a week later they preach on it and kill it, and you're like, oh, that's what that means. But you were invited into the process of helping to think through and watching how somebody else thinks and come to a conclusion. And so it's not just about downloading the information, it's about how did the person reach that conclusion. That's an important part of that, because the people in our congregations are not going to, they're going to have a whole different list of ways in which they need to apply the truth that we preach on a Sunday morning. So seeing how do I make this decision is as important as the content that's being expressed. And so that's something we're thinking about in our teaching. But then also, I think if we can break past the idea that our church, I know it's so easy to get caught in, and we always talk about it, but our church is not confined to our building. And that is crucial. If we can get Christians connecting with each other outside of the four walls of our church, and kind of infiltrating our community in that way, and those relationships forming, I think that's just a real sign of health. When the church is meeting and encouraging and spending time in each other's homes and doing life together. And it's not just a Sunday morning interaction, but there's that permeation of life together. Those are great things. So I think we could, go on and on list of things that are really helpful, but those are some of the things that popped into my mind. But the necessity of the local church as a plausibility of saying Christianity really does work in this context, in this community, and look at what's happening. That is a wonderful thing that has to be emphasized. And then again, and this is the selfishness of a 29-year-old saying, help me connect to older people in the church. A lot of the issues that they've already been through are exactly the same ones I'm trying to go through. It's a different color and different shape, but the issues are really the same. And so there's that. I would also, I would be, this is maybe just my own personal thing and maybe not indicative of my generation, but I think there is a need for, I hesitate to use the word tradition, but there is a stability that's attractive to the church. And so I think where churches go wrong is if they bend over backwards and say, well, this is what the next generation wants, and so we need to do this. I think there should be room for my voice, but I also think I'm 29 and you shouldn't take my voice too seriously. If you understand what I'm saying, that don't bend over backwards to the next generation. I like to joke and say that my definition of a conservative church is a church that looks to its parents' generation for how things ought to be done. A liberal church is a church that looks to the next generation for things ought to be done. And I think we want to be people that look to Jesus for how things ought to be done, and do that together. So I would balance that of saying, take the young runts under your arms and appreciate them and teach them and show them the process of making decisions and leading. But don't put all the eggs in that basket, please.
Could you talk about the role of, or how you, in church dynamics, the process of, well, let me back up. You talked about the church being a parallel community to sort of the rest of society, a different community. But that community, by definition, has to have some form or boundary or descriptors. What's the role of the church in helping? I mean, who creates that, or how are those things created? That gives the church some definition.
Yeah, wow, great question. I think the way that my wife and I phrase this is, how do we maintain distinction without isolation? So if we're doing something parallel to the rest of the world, those of us in the room may know people who have been so separate from the world that there isn't any evangelism and cultural impact happening, and then that we can have assimilation to the point that there isn't anything distinctive left about us. And that's, I think, the question you're asking, is where is that line drawn for us as we maintain our distinctiveness but don't isolate ourselves from being effective? I think that's a daily moment of prayer. And it's by the grace of God that we balance that line of being distinctive to the point that the person other than us feels genuinely loved by us, not necessarily judged and ostracized by our distinction and difference, but they know that we genuinely care for them. And there's a huge difference here between what I call a standing embrace and a chasing embrace. And a standing embrace says, here we are as the church, and this is the line we've drawn. This is the boundary that we understand what it means to follow Jesus. This is how far we can come. And we're standing here with our arms open wide saying, come on. We want you to be part of us. Come on in. But we're not crossing this line. This is where our boundary is. This is where our biblical understanding of what it means to be a church ends, right here. And we're standing with our arms open wide saying, come on, be part of us. That's one thing. Where that goes wrong is when it becomes a chasing embrace and we go say, hey, everybody come in. We're going to go track you down and hug you and pull you in. I think we need to keep that line clear. But the orientation with our boundaries is to invite people into that, not boundaries to exclude people from that. And so that's how I think about it in my mind. And I think it is a daily prayer when walk out the door, we should be asking the Lord that of guide me as I walk that line between distinction and, deep impact in the world. So that's a great question. And I think each congregation will probably come to different points and boundary lines, maybe, depending on the context in which they're functioning and serving on some of the specifics of that. But I think we want to, even if we're not good at it, know that that's the balance that we're shooting for, and by the grace of God, walk on that and not slip either direction on that. So I don't feel like I've answered your question. I've just re-articulated it, or just articulated it in a different way. But I think having the vocabulary of knowing that we do want distinction without separation is what Jesus did. Jesus, the holiest of them all, got himself into some pretty interesting situations, but he always had parameters for that person accepting him. Somehow we've gotten into this idea of the unconditional love of God, meaning that there aren't conditions on loving God back. God does love everybody, but at the wedding banquet, he says, come, and then he says, what's up with this guy who's not in a wedding garment? God loves everybody, but we come to him on his terms, not on our own terms. And so we don't impose our ideas on God. We come in submission to him. And as long as we can keep that balance clear, I think the Lord will guide us in making that distinction and that balance.
Just to follow up to that, what do you see as the church's role in shaping its own boundaries for its people, or does every individual have their own boundaries? I guess I've wondered how community creates an identity, how a church community creates an identity in this vein of thinking. I guess. Does that make sense at all?
It does. And what's your name?
Jeremy.
Jeremy. Okay. So here's what I think Jesus had in mind for the church, and something that we should shoot for, is that let's say Jeremy and Nathan are part of the same church, and you are a good, upstanding, moral citizen, you're ethical in your business and the way that you treat your wife and your family and your neighbors. If that's true, and we're part of the same church, I want to be judged in my character based off of what people think about you. Does that make sense? And the same thing should be true for me. When you say, hey, what church do you go to? I should say this, and somebody should be able to say, I know Jeremy, he's a good man, he's from that church. And they make a moral value about me because I'm united with you in Christ, and we have the common experience of receiving the same love, and we work and act and function in the same way. That type of collective witness is exponentially more powerful than individuals working in isolation. So you can have so if you did something wonderful for somebody in the community, but they had no clue why you did it, and I did something that was really helpful and beneficial, and they had no clue why I did it, no witness happens, even if we did that out of good motivation. A couple years ago, when my brother was in his undergrad, somebody who had just become a Christian came to his door and was on some team or club and wanted him to buy a raffle ticket for supporting the event. And my brother said, well, I'm interested in you and your project. I'm not going to buy a raffle ticket, but I'd like to make a contribution to what you're doing because I'm for you. And then she went next door to one of his Christian buddies, and she said, hey, would you like to buy a chance on this thing? And he said, you know what? I don't want to buy a raffle ticket, but I really care about you, and I'm interested in your project, and I'd like to make a contribution to what you're doing. And she said, and he gave her some money, and she stopped, and then she ran back to my brother and said, do Christians not buy chances on things? And he said, well, no, I don't. And so the conversation took off from there, but it was because of the consistency of the behavior of two people back to back that she got to thinking, maybe it's something broader than just about this one individual. So I think, to answer your question, a community can develop distinctives of identity in a way that are very beneficial for its community impact and witness. If what we're doing and the positive things that we're doing are done in the name of Christ and people can connect that to its source, then that is helpful. And so I think a church has every right to be interested in doing that. If it comes down to our physical appearance, there is an interesting thing that if we dress to the standards of our job, that's professionalism. If it's to our school, that's school pride. If it's to our sports team, that's team spirit. But if it's to our church, it's legalism. Not quite sure where the boundary is there. And so that's worth thinking about as you draw those distinctions. If that was at all part of your question. Well, we've just gone through an hour. For me, it seems like that, but for you, it might have seemed like eternity. Time is relative. So why don't we go ahead and bring the formal part of this to a close, and I'll be around up front here if you want to come and ask me questions, and I'll defer you to somebody else or something like that. For those of you who are interested in the list of questions that I said would be good for teenagers going off into the world on their own or to college, and we're interested in that list, I'll have my laptop up front, and you can come type your email address in there, and we'll make sure that we get that information along to you. But thanks for your questions. It's a lot of fun for me to think about those, and it'll continue to give me things to think about. Appreciate it.